Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I would like to welcome you to this lecture, which is covering China from the origins of Chinese civilization to about the year 600. If we take a look at the map of China, this is a more modern map, but it gives a good idea of what we're operating or what we're looking at in terms of Chinese environments. We have primarily two main river systems in China. We have the northern river system known as the Yellow River or the Huanghe River, and we have the Yangtze River, which is the South River. Egypt has a lot of different environmental characteristics. We've got desert regions up here around Mongolia. We've got rainforest areas located down here in southeast China. We've got, of course, mountainous regions here that form the borders. We have the Himalayan mountain chain here, which effectively kind of seals off China from the rest of Asia. And last but not least, up here, connecting to those kind of arid temperatures and arid conditions, we have the Mongolian cities. We have the Mongolian country, which has the Gobi Desert operating in it. So a lot of different cultural and environmental characteristics, which produces a very vibrant and differentiated culture in China. Now, if we start by taking a look at the culture of China, what I've tried to do is identify a few particularly monumental or thematic cultural traits. First and foremost, we have our Neolithic Revolution take place in the year 6500 BCE. This is when the Chinese first settled down and began to farm. We have the Iritu cultural tradition, which is kind of our basic prehistoric cultural tradition of China. Now, within the overarching culture of China, we can identify two other facets of cultural expression. We see, for example, ancestor reverence, which refers to the Chinese kind of revering of both elderly in their society, as well as related to their religious practices, a belief that dead ancestors were in fact spiritual entities that could impact daily life. And that kind of relates us to the religion of China, which was predominantly what we call a polytheistic religion. It focused upon initially animal sacrifice and divination, or basically meaning the use of omens and portents to kind of tell the future. And as time went on, we have a continuing evolution of this polytheistic religious tradition to basically evolving into different religious traditions. Probably the most popular and the most known, which is Taoism. In terms of our Egyptian government system, I'll move this up just for a minute. We have the beginnings as our government came together of what we call the imperial dynastic cycles. And what that refers to is that a dynasty was a particular family of China that would rule what was called the imperial area of China over the course of centuries. And as time goes on, what will happen on the map, as we'll kind of point out and show, is that the imperial region of China was predominantly on a consistent level growing until eventually it reached almost the boundaries of modern China today. So we have what is called these dynastic cycles. Early on in Chinese history, we're going to have the creation of a bureaucratic system, which enabled these emperors or these kings to rule China through agents that were paid by the imperial system. And last but not least, we have what's called the Mandate of Heaven, which is the theoretical or the ideological background to explain why the emperor or why the king has the power to basically to control China. And the theory of the Mandate of Heaven was the belief that the heavens, if you will, the yin and the yang, if we're talking in terms of Taoism, the universe would select people that were selected to rule China. And the basis for this selection was dependent upon how the universe was either in harmonious unity, which meant that it would select a good ruler, or if the universe was in a disharmonious state, it would select a bad ruler, which would then bring basically bad things and bring problems and instability to the Chinese government. And the idea was that the mandate of heaven would be bestowed upon a ruler only if they could keep it, only if they could maintain power. And if another rival government was actually another rival person took over, then the universe had basically corrected its error and had selected a new person and basically transferred that mandate of heaven onto a new ruler. I hope that makes sense. Now, as we go through the history of China, then, we're going to focus upon these particular dynasties that are going to basically come and go. Our first dynasty of China is called the Xia dynasty, which dates from about 2000 to about 1800. Now, this dynasty actually predates Chinese writing, which means that the Xia dynasty is in fact a prehistoric Chinese dynasty. We can't really identify a lot about its nature except based on its archaeological evidence. What we can say is that they seem to have multiple centers of power, and that near the end of their reign, the Chinese were beginning to adopt the use of bronze, which basically constitutes both a technological and a temporal change, a technological innovation in being able to create bronze, as well as nearing into what we call the Bronze Age, which is generally considered to be, as I've mentioned before, the age of civilization, the age of government. Now, at some point in time, maybe the 1600s, maybe the 1700s, maybe the 1800s, the Xia dynasty began to fail, and it would eventually be replaced by the Yin or the Shang dynasty. And it's under the Shang that we enter into what we call the historical period of China, because we have the creation of Chinese writing. The Chinese alphabet is created, which, in case you're wondering, as a point of trivia, is the oldest alphabet still in use in the world today. We have the movement of the capital away from what was called the traditional capital of Xi'an to the city of Anyang. And we have a continuing evolution and definition of the idea of the theoretical ideal of the Chinese government. Now, the reason why I moved the video box is to point out the colored area on the map. And this is the colored area represents what I referred to earlier as the so-called imperial kingdom of China. This colored area represents the amount of area that the Chinese king could issue a decree or issue a law and reasonably expect that law to be followed. So this is basically the geographical extent of the power of the monarchy or the dynasty of the Shang dynasty. Now, that doesn't mean that more people didn't live out here, but these peoples were scattered. There was not a high level or a high degree of organization, and this was kind of what we might call unincorporated China. And what we'll see as we go along is we will see this imperial area increase in size as we go along. Now, the Shang dynasty was a very stable dynasty. It lasted almost 500 years. But eventually, like what always happens to these kind of imperial dynasties, a lack of leadership, internal fighting, and problems eventually led to the creation of a new dynasty. And the rise of a new dynasty we call the Chu dynasty. Now, you'll notice on the slide, it mentions that it's a Western Chu dynasty. And what this refers to is the Chu dynasty lasted quite a long time. It lasted from 1027 until approximately the 200s. And over the course of that time, we have a period of time when the Chu dynasty was very strong and very organized and contained, and that would be up to the year 770. And then we have a period of decline and fragmentation, which took place from 770 until the 200s. Now, The capital of the Western Chu dynasty was moved back to that traditional location of the city of Ha, which also was commonly referred to as Xi'an or Chang'an. And the Chus, once again, were an extremely stable government. They continued to kind of write about and evolve that idea of the mandate of heaven. And it's during the Chu dynasty that we see the emergence of traditional Chinese religion into a religion we call Taoism. And just to briefly talk about Taoism, Taoism was a belief in the overarching nature of the universe as being somewhat balanced. The two main forces of balance were the so-called yin and yang. And those two powers working in tension and opposition with each other created the balance of the universe and actually created the environmental and historical factors that basically kept the world going. Now, as time went on, the belief was that if the yin and the yang, which were completely impersonal, unconscious forces, kind of like gravity, if these forces became disharmonious, if they grew out of balance, that's when bad things happened. That's when evil occurred. And that's when basically the evil deities, the evil supernatural powers, that's what they worked to do. They worked to unbalance the yin and the yang so as to create chaos, misery, and death. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that the Chu dynasty also basically took a path of what we call creating a feudal empire. And what the term feudal means, in very simplistic terms, is decentralized. And what that means is that the Chu dynasty basically spread out power and gave power to its generals in order to maintain an army and to support the dynasty. But that power base was basically spread out, and as a result, the actual Chu dynasty leaders, the Chu emperors, were fairly weak and fairly ineffective in controlling things because of this decentralized nature. Now, what the turning point of the Chu dynasty is, what occurred in the year 770, is an invasion of China by a group of invaders that the Chinese just basically designate as barbarians. And to make a long story short, the barbarians came in from the north, they attacked the city of Xi'an, they killed the emperor, and they sacked the city. Now, in the aftermath of this, the Chu dynasty, the successor, basically decided to move the capital farther away from the barbarians. And when he did this, he basically created a situation whereby all of those regional generals who wielded some degree of power began to lose faith and began to basically lose their, they decided to be more independent of the Chu dynasty. And this period is called the Spring and Autumn period, in which we have the decline of the Chu dynasty and its eventual collapse into the period called the period of warring states. Now, interesting enough, it's during this decline that we have the emergence of arguably the most important Chinese philosopher in Chinese history. And that individual is commonly referred to in the Western world as Confucius. Now, he is commonly referred to in Asian circles as Kongzi or as Fuzi. The term Zi in Chinese generally is equated to the idea of teacher or mentor. And we've taken all those terms kind of together and created the term Confucius. Now, what Confucius did was he tried to support or kind of prop up the failing government. He didn't want the government to change. And because of that, he tried to lock China into a belief of their emperors, of their rulers, as kind of locked into a more recognizable relationship of father to son. And Confucius argued that people should follow the will of the emperor, not because he had the power or the influence to make them do that, but because he was in effect their political father, and they should do what he said, and they should respect him. Now, the interesting thing is that in terms of trying to stabilize the Chu dynasty, Confucius was a complete failure. The Chu dynasty continued to basically fragment, and eventually it imploded. But what made Confucius the greatest Chinese philosopher is that his ideas about family, his ideas about avoiding change and being conservative, basically locked China in to a period of very little technological and intellectual growth for more than 2,000 years. And so basically, what happens because of Confucius's motives is China basically becomes kind of locked into a Confucian frame of mind. And that's why every philosopher after Confucius is generally referred to as a Neo-Confucian or a new Confucian scholar. Now, as time continued to basically pass and the Chinese state continued to break down, we have the passage into what's called the period of warring states. And it's during this time period, while the political nature of China fragmented, the religious nature of China began to become more focused. We have a continuing evolution of Taoism to basically try to explain that the yin and the yang are in fact conscious forces working for the betterment of humankind. And we have the emergence of a Confucian scholar by the name of Mencius or Mengzi. And Mengzi is actually going to argue, in the face of all these bad times, Mengzi is going to argue that humans were basically born good and that human nature tended to be positive. Now, I know this sounds pretty basic and pretty normal, but just to give you an idea of context, it will take the Western world approximately about 2,000 years to reach that same conclusion about human nature. For the bulk of Western history, the idea of human nature has been one that is focused on flawed, basically failed human nature that tends towards negativeness as opposed to being positive. And so Mengzi represents an eventual cultural shift that would take place in the Western world, considering our ideas of humans and human nature. It takes place at a much earlier rate in the basically the 300s and early 200s BCE. Now, that period of warring states lasted more than 250 years, and eventually it gave rise to a very powerful and very short-lived dynasty called the Qin dynasty. And the Qin dynasty only lasted 14 years. The king of the Qin took the title, Qin Shi Huang, took the title of Shu Wan Di, which means emperor. And basically his reign put in place a lot of particular events and traits and cultural ideas that would continue to influence China for thousands of years after him. In case you're wondering, this picture up here is the so-called tomb of the first emperor. It's known as one of the wonders of the ancient world. It is a tomb which houses approximately 3,000 terracotta soldiers, each one of them being different, each one of them being a life model, if you will, or a life cast of a member of the emperor's army. If we take a look at the map, you'll notice that the Qin dynasty is quite a bit larger than the Xin dynasty or the Chu dynasty. It's extending all the way down to the coast of China and all the way to the western coast of China. Eastern coast of China. It's also during this reign that we have the start of the creation of the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China is a human architectural masterpiece. It's the only man-made object that can be visibly seen from outer space. It stretches for hundreds of miles, and it took over 1,000 years to construct. And eventually, it's unfinished. The Chinese government eventually just basically gave up on it. It was originally built to try and keep invaders out of northern China. And in that respect, it ultimately would be a failure. Now, the other thing that the king or the emperor created is he created the first bureaucratic system in China, which was a bureaucratic system directly, basically, under his control. And it's this bureaucratic system that basically stabilized China and locked in a lot of its cultural and technological change. Now, contrary to popular belief, however, the first emperor was actually anti-Confucian. He actually tried to destroy Confucianism, primarily because of the fact that Confucius was a great supporter of the Chu dynasty, and he, in effect, is actually the successor of the Chu dynasty. He's the dynasty that replaced it. Now, the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, was extremely unpopular in Chinese history. He was extremely unpopular to the people he ruled, and that's why his dynastic reign is so short. He basically was able to take over. He created the dynasty, but upon his death in 207, his family was wiped out, and the dynasty basically replaced by a dynasty commonly referred to as the Golden Age of China, which we call the Han Dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty, as you can see here, is continuing that extension of imperial power farther and wider. It's one of the great dynasties of Chinese history. It lasted a little more than 400 years. Be careful here. We're moving from 206 BCE to 220 CE. So it's actually more than 400 years, 414 years. In a lot of ways, the Han Dynasty tried to reestablish connection back to the Chu Dynasty, back to that earlier time period. They moved the capital back to the traditional site of imperial power, being the city of Xi'an or Chang'an. One thing they did recognize as being great was that Qin bureaucratic system. So they retained that and augmented it. They increased its size. But here's the big innovation they made to that bureaucratic system. They actually infused it with Confucian ideals and created an exam that was required of all people to be government officials. This exam was based on Confucianism, which explains kind of how those Confucian ideals were locked into Chinese culture. Now, it's also under the Han Dynasty that we have the continuation or the creation of trade in the form of the Silk Trade Route. It's under the Han Dynasty that silkworms were domesticated, and it's for the first time the Chinese actually began to trade with locals outside of their kingdom, being primarily the Nepalese and the Indian people. And this is the start of one of the most popular and most important trade routes in ancient history, which is called the Silk Road or the Silk Route. Just to give you an idea of its importance, it would actually be the attempt to bypass the Silk Route to go directly to India and China for trade that would basically spark all the exploration that took place in the 1400s and 1500s AD or CE, which basically gave rise to the foundation and discovery of America, as well as the start of what we call the early modern world. So that trade route was, in terms of the ancient and medieval world, the most important and the most lucrative or most economically successful trade route in world history. Just to kind of finish the door or shut the door on the Han Dynasty, we call it the Golden Age of China. We have some technological innovation. We have the invention of paper, the invention of block type printing, the invention of porcelain, hydraulic machinery. We have innovations in mathematics, the use of negative numbers, innovations in shipbuilding, as well as more of a focus on astronomy and map making. So a lot of technological innovation going on, but the one thing I want to point out is that despite all of this technological innovation, it did not translate into social or cultural change, because most of what invented was related to basically Confucianism or related to basically theory and not practice. Just to give you a wider idea, on the next slide, I've got a kind of a map showing that silk trade route. So we basically have two routes that would sometimes come together. One leg of the route would go from the south through India, up through Persia, and connect to the Mediterranean Sea. The northern route would connect to the Caspian and the Black Seas, and then basically connect back to the Mediterranean. So it's through the Silk Route that we have the connection, at least during different time periods, the connection of India, and to a much lesser extent China, with the Mediterranean world and with the Middle Eastern world in terms of the connection of these trade routes. Now, our last slide concerning Chinese history is going to be the eventual failure of the Han Dynasty. We have a series of regional uprisings as the leadership of the dynasty failed. We enter into what's called the era of the Three Kingdoms, a period where there were three separate dynasties ruling parts of China. That was then consolidated very briefly in what's called the Jin Dynasty, which lasted a couple of hundred years, but which then broke back up into what's called the era of disunity. We have regional dynasties, sometimes numbering more than 20 regional dynasties throughout China. Eventually, those dynasties would be usurped and conquered by one dynasty called the Sui Dynasty, which later gave rise to the Tang Dynasty and later Chinese dynasties. Now, that's a lot of political change that took place. What kept China stable, what kept it together, was a combination of two factors. One being the Confucian lockdown of culture and technology, in a sense. That kept things very stable in China. And number two, that continuation of that bureaucratic system, which remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. Basically, irregardless of who the emperor was, the local everyday Chinese citizen or Chinese peasant maintained a relationship with the same local bureaucrat. And then what happened over time is those local bureaucrats, their children became the next generation of bureaucrats who dealt exclusively with the children of the farmers and peasants of that region. And so what we have, because of this bureaucratic system, is an extremely stable, locked down Chinese culture, which ultimately would prove to be China's real undoing. Because of all this cultural lockdown and technological lockdown, while other peoples and other places were advancing technologically, politically, and socially, China remained kind of locked in a bubble without change or without significant change. And because of that, when we return to China, and we won't return to China probably in this class until we talk about the Mongols, but when we return to China proper in World Civ II, what we're going to find is that China in the 1800s is dreadfully way behind the rest of the world in both its technological and its political and social institutions. And because of that, China is the Chinese government is going to undergo attack and eventual implosion, which will then lead to more than 100 years of basically destabilization, internal civil war, until eventually in the 1940s, we have the emergence of the communist state of China. I know that's a lot of information. I thank you for taking the time to watch the video and listen to the lecture. Once again, there will be a lecture on the invasion of China by the Mongolians in the 11 and 1200s. And until then, like I say, we'll leave China in its kind of technologically static bubble, and we'll take a look at other places. Thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you again in later lectures.